Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, 1944. A group of young American soldiers are standing inside a small wooden room. They've been told it is a training exercise. They've been told to put on gas masks. Some of them have the masks, some of them do not. The door behind them closes. It locks. Then gas begins piping into the room. Not a simulation, not a drill. Actual mustard gas, actual lewisite, the same chemicals that had burned and blinded soldiers in the trenches of World War I, pumped into a sealed wooden room containing American soldiers who had no idea they were about to become test subjects. Every single soldier in that room was black. The white soldiers assigned to the same program were outside in the control group, watching. This happened. It happened to approximately 60,000 American soldiers over the course of World War II. Black men, Puerto Rican men, Japanese American men, chosen specifically because of the color of their skin by their own government, by their own army. And when it was over, the men who survived it were told something that may be the single most extraordinary order issued to any American soldier in the entire history of the war. They were told never to speak about what had been done to them, or they would go to prison for 40 years. His name was Rollins Edwards. He was 21 years old. He had been drafted in 1943 to fight the Nazis. Instead, the United States Army used him to test a chemical weapon on American soil. He kept silent for 50 years because they told him to. Then he started carrying a jar, a glass jar, full of his own skin, because nobody believed him.
More than 70 years after the gas was pumped into that room, Rollins Edwards' skin was still falling off in flakes. 70 years. The chemical burns that the Army inflicted on him in 1944 never fully healed. They couldn't. Mustard gas and lewisite damage DNA. They don't just burn the surface, they work at a cellular level, and the damage they cause does not stop when the exposure stops. Edwards described the sensation of being gassed as a million fire ants on you and stinging at the same time. He lived with that sensation, its aftermath, its permanent echo on his skin for the rest of his life. He died in 2017. He was 92 years old. He was still asking the federal government to properly compensate him and the men who had been through the same room when he died. Here is the detail that separates this story from every other World War II injustice story you have ever heard. The program was not a rogue operation. It was not unauthorized. It was not the work of one bad commander making a decision his superiors would have overruled. It was official, organized, budgeted, staffed, conducted with the full knowledge and approval of the United States Department of Defense. And it specifically chose black soldiers as its test subjects, not despite the racism embedded in the American military in 1944, but because of it. Because black soldiers, in the calculus of the military that drafted them, were more expendable, more useful as data than as men. To understand how this happened, how the country that sent these men to fight fascism was simultaneously running a program that treated them as laboratory animals, you have to understand who Rollins Edwards was before any of this began, and you have to understand the world he was drafted into. Rollins Edwards carried a jar of his own dead skin for years, not as a metaphor, literally, a glass jar full of skin flakes, which he showed to anyone who would listen when they told him he had no proof of what had happened to him. The story of why he had to do that and why the government that did this to him spent 50 years making sure he could not prove it is what this video exists to tell. Subscribe and turn on notifications. He spent his entire life trying to make people hear this. The least we can do is make sure it travels.
Rollins Edwards was born on March 5, 1922 in South Carolina. He grew up in the American South in an era when the word segregation did not begin to describe the full scope of what that meant daily, where you could sit, where you could eat, what schools existed for your children, what work would be offered to you, what happened to you if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was drafted into the Army in 1943, assigned to the 1329th General Service Regiment, sent for training at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. He was ready to fight the Nazis. He had said as much. He understood what the war was about, what was at stake, why it mattered. He had volunteered nothing. He had been drafted, but he went. What he was not told when he arrived at Camp Claiborne was that his assignment there was not going to be the training he had been promised. The bivouac was set up deep in the piney backwoods of Louisiana, not close to much of anything. Edwards and about 20 other black soldiers, all strangers culled from different units, were told to line up. They had not trained together. They did not know each other. They had not been told why they were there, what they were being asked to do, or what would happen to them. You had no choice. You did not know where you were going. They didn't tell you anything. Rollins Edwards. Every day, for 30 days, Rollins Edwards and the other soldiers were given gas masks, some days with masks that fit, some days with masks that didn't, and locked in a wooden room that was then pumped full of chemical agents. Mustard gas, lewisite, the same weapons the world had agreed to ban in warfare after the First World War, being used by the United States Army in American soldiers in Louisiana in 1944. Rollins Edwards was told to line up. He didn't know why. He didn't know what was coming. He had no choice in any of it. And yet he showed up because he was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders, and he went into that room 30 times over 30 days. What do you think that kind of compliance costs a person? Not the gas itself, but the requirement to keep trusting an institution that is doing this to you day after day because you have no other option.
The officers led them to a small wooden structure. The walls were wooden. The floor was wooden. There were no windows. There was a door. The men went inside. The door closed. The gas came in through a pipe. It felt like you were on fire. Guys started screaming and hollering and trying to break out, and then some of the guys fainted. And finally they opened the door and let us out, and the guys were they were in bad shape. That was one day. There were 30 of them. Every day for a month, Rollins Edwards walked back into that room. Because they told him to. Because refusing was not an option that existed for a black soldier in the United States Army in 1944. Because the entire apparatus of military authority, court-martial, prison, dishonorable discharge, sat behind every order given by every white officer above him, and the order was clear: you will participate. What happened inside those 30 sessions was designed with deliberate scientific methodology to map the difference in how mustard gas and lewisite affected skin of different colors. They said we were being tested to see what effect these gases would have on black skins. Not soldiers, not men, black skins. The United States Army had decided that the most useful thing about Rollins Edwards was the color of his skin. The white soldiers enrolled in the same program were outside. They were the control group. Their role was to establish what a normal reaction to chemical weapons exposure looked like, and then compare it to what happened to the men of color who had been selected specifically to absorb the exposure that the white soldiers were protected from. This was not an accident. It was not an improvisation. It was designed this way by scientists and administrators in the United States Department of Defense at a time when the United States was fighting a war against a regime whose racial ideology the world had correctly identified as monstrous. The same military, the same calendar year, a different application of the same idea. The program specifically used black, Puerto Rican, and Japanese American soldiers as the subjects for chemical exposure, and white soldiers as the untouched control group, so scientists could compare the racial difference in reaction. The military that was fighting a war against Hitler's racial ideology was running a program built on its own racial hierarchy. I am not going to tell you what to do with that fact. I want to know what you do with it.
Rollins Edwards was not alone. The program that processed him in Louisiana was not the only one. Experiments were conducted at multiple sites across the country and in U.S. territories. In Panama, where soldiers were sent to the jungle and bombarded with mustard gas sprayed from military aircraft overhead. At Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, where Japanese-American soldiers were exposed in laboratory settings. In naval facilities where seawater was used to intensify the burns. On ships, in tents, in concrete buildings. At least 60,000 American servicemen were enrolled in the program in total. A Puerto Rican soldier named Filemon Lopez Negron described what it was like to be on the receiving end of an aerial mustard gas attack in the jungle, with military planes flying overhead. We had uniforms on to protect ourselves, but the animals didn't. There were rabbits. They all died. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital with a bad fever. Almost all of us got sick. The rabbits all died. The Puerto Rican soldiers who replaced the rabbits spent 3 weeks in the hospital. A Japanese-American soldier named Louis Besho was tested at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, used specifically as a proxy for the enemy, on the theory that what mustard gas did to his skin would predict what it might do to Japanese soldiers if the United States deployed chemical weapons in the Pacific. He was not the enemy. He was an American. He had been drafted by the same country that had simultaneously imprisoned his family in an internment camp under Executive Order 9066. He was fighting for a country that had locked up his family, and that country was now using him to simulate the enemy he had told him he was fighting for. All of these experiments, every session, every chamber, every aerial spray, were conducted with the full authorization of the United States Department of Defense. And when they were over, every man who had participated in them was told the same thing. The program used Japanese-American soldiers specifically to simulate the enemy, to test how Japanese soldiers might react to chemical weapons. The same soldiers whose families had been imprisoned in internment camps were now being used as human proxies for the people their country had labeled as threats. How many layers of a single institution's betrayal can be applied to one person simultaneously? I am genuinely asking, because I am still counting them. Rollins Edwards is still alive in this story right now. He has just been gassed for the 30th time. He is about to be told something that will determine the rest of his life. He doesn't know yet that the secret he is about to be given is not the end of the story. He doesn't know that he will spend 70 more years trying to make his own government acknowledge what it did. He doesn't know about the jar. If this account is holding your attention the way it should, subscribe now. The silence they tried to impose on him is the second half of this story, and it is as important as the gas chamber itself.
When the 30 days of testing were over, the soldiers were debriefed. The Army told them several things. It told them they had served their country. It told them the information gathered from the experiments would help protect American soldiers in future conflicts. And it told them that what had happened in that camp, in those rooms, over those 30 days, was classified information. Top secret. Never to be discussed. Never to be disclosed to anyone. Not family, not doctors, not members of Congress. If they spoke about it, they would be charged with violating military secrecy. They would go to prison for 40 years. Rollins Edwards went back to his unit. He was sent overseas. He served in the European theater. He served in the Pacific theater. He fought in the war he had been drafted to fight. And he kept the secret. Not because he wanted to, because the alternative was 40 years in a military prison. But keeping the secret came with a cost that the Army had not told him about. Because the experiments hadn't just hurt him once. They were still hurting him. All of the World War II experiments with mustard gas were done in secret and weren't recorded on the subject's official military records. There was no record that it had happened. Because the experiment itself was classified, the injuries it produced were invisible to the medical system that was supposed to treat them. When Edwards went to the Veterans Administration for treatment of the skin conditions that were spreading and deepening and refusing to heal, conditions caused directly by the chemical exposure his own government had subjected him to, he could not tell his doctors what had caused them. He couldn't. It was classified. He had been ordered to say nothing. So the doctors treated him for conditions they couldn't diagnose properly, because the cause was a secret the Army had sworn him to keep. They burned him, classified the burn, and then denied him treatment because he couldn't tell his doctors what had caused his injuries, because telling his doctors would violate the classified order that protected the program that gave him the injuries in the first place. I want you to take a moment with the geometry of that. What do you call a system that perfectly constructs its own impunity? Because I've been trying to find the right word for it for weeks. For decades, Rollins Edwards lived with what the Army had done to him. The skin conditions persisted, spread, worsened in some years, plateaued in others, never went away. More than 70 years after the exposure, his skin was still falling off in flakes, a visible, permanent, daily reminder of 30 sessions in a wooden room in Louisiana. He tried to tell people. He tried to tell Veterans Administration officials. He tried to tell doctors. He tried to tell anyone who would listen that he had been subjected to chemical weapons testing by his own Army, and that the burns that were spreading across his body decades later were the direct result of what had been done to him. Nobody believed him. The records didn't exist. The program was classified. There was no documentation, no official acknowledgement, no proof that any of it had happened, because the Army had specifically ensured, by classifying the entire program and keeping it off the soldiers' official records, that the men it had experimented on would have no way to prove what had been done to them. Rollins Edwards found a way to prove it anyway. He started carrying a jar. A glass jar full of the flakes of his own skin that fell off his body because of chemical burns inflicted in 1944, still falling off decades later. He carried it everywhere. He showed it to officials, to journalists, to anyone who told him there was no proof. He held up the jar and said, "Here is your proof. This is what they did. It is still happening. Look." A man had to carry evidence of his own ongoing injury in a jar because the government that gave him the injury had erased the record that it happened. He kept fighting for decades, long after most people would have given up, long after the men who ran that program in Louisiana were dead and gone and beyond accountability, long after the Army had moved on and classified and filed and forgotten. Rollins Edwards did not forget. He could not forget. His skin would not let him. Rollins Edwards carried a jar of his own dead skin for years to prove what had been done to him. Not a document, not a photograph, not a witness statement. His own body was the only proof he had that the Army would not or could not make disappear. What does it cost a person day after day to be forced into that position by the institution that caused the injury in the first place? The program was officially declassified in 1993, 50 years after it happened. By that point, many of the men who had been through those rooms were dead. Of the approximately 3,900 veterans later identified in NPR's investigation as having been exposed to mustard gas in these experiments, the Veterans Administration had located and offered compensation to 610 of them. 610 out of nearly 4,000. If this story is landing the way it should, subscribe, share it with one person who hasn't heard it, not to help a channel, because Rollins Edwards spent his entire life trying to make people hear this, and the least we can do is make sure it travels further than it has. Type his name in the comments. Rollins Edwards. Because someone should say it.
In 1991, 47 years after Rollins Edwards walked out of that wooden room in Louisiana, the Pentagon released a report. It acknowledged, in the flat language of institutional admission, that the Army had tested mustard gas on American soldiers during World War II. It did not acknowledge the racial targeting. Not yet. That revelation would wait another 2 decades. 2 years later, in 1993, the full program was officially declassified. 50 years of enforced silence officially lifted. Edwards could finally, legally, talk about what had happened to him. He could tell his doctors. He could tell his family. He could tell the Veterans Administration officials he had been fighting for decades. The problem was the benefit system that was supposed to compensate him had been built to process documentation, official military records, physician reports, service records. And the Army had specifically ensured that none of those records existed for the men it had experimented on. The declassification said the program was real. It did not automatically generate the paperwork that was supposed to never have existed. Edwards and his lawyer spent years fighting to prove, through every bureaucratic channel available to them, that he had actually been there, that the burns were real, that the connection between the 1944 experiment and the 2015 skin flakes in the jar was causally real and legally compensable. Meanwhile, a journalist named Caitlin Dickerson at NPR was filing Freedom of Information Act requests. In 2015, she published what she found. Caitlin Dickerson's investigation, published June 22, 2015, established several things that the 1991 and 1993 releases had not. First, the racial targeting was not incidental, it was designed. The experiments were specifically structured to test how chemical agents affected different races, with Black, Puerto Rican, and Japanese American soldiers used as the test subjects, and white soldiers used as the baseline control group. This was not an accident of who happened to be available. It was a deliberate choice, documented in the scientific methodology of the program itself. Second, the scale was enormous. At least 60,000 American soldiers had been enrolled in some version of these experiments. The VA, as of Dickerson's reporting, had located and offered compensation to approximately 610 of them. Third, many of the men had been unable to seek medical treatment for decades because the classification order had prevented them from telling their doctors what had caused their injuries. Medical historian Susan Smith at the University of Alberta described to Dickerson what the long-term health consequences of mustard gas exposure look like. So frequently, you will see things like chronic skin problems, including skin cancer, that never goes away. Chronic, never goes away. For Rollins Edwards, that meant 70 years.
For other men in the program, it meant whatever number of years they had left after the exposure, some of them shortened by what had been done to them. The NPR investigation also found something else. A letter had been sent to President Roosevelt during the war by someone who had witnessed the experiments in Louisiana, informing the president that chemical weapons were being tested on black soldiers. Edwards himself described this in the Library of Congress oral history. Somebody wrote President Roosevelt a handwritten letter and told him that these experiments with these black soldiers were going on in Louisiana and Tuskegee, Alabama. A letter was sent to the President of the United States. The program continued. Someone told the President. The President did nothing. The men kept going into the room. Someone wrote a handwritten letter to Franklin Roosevelt during the war, specifically to tell him that black soldiers were being used as chemical weapons test subjects in Louisiana. That letter reached him. The program continued. What do you do with the specific, documented knowledge that the commander-in-chief was informed, and the answer was silence?
Rollins Edwards came home. He came home to a country that had used his body as a chemical weapons testing ground, classified the evidence of what it had done, and denied him the medical treatment that would have required him to explain the classified evidence. He came home to a South Carolina that was still segregated. He came home to a Veterans Administration that had no record of his 30 sessions in that room in Louisiana. He could have disappeared quietly into private life and let the jar sit in a cupboard somewhere. He didn't. In the 1970s, Rollins Edwards became the first African American elected to the Dorchester County Council in South Carolina. He later served on the Somerville Town Council, becoming the first black person elected to that body as well. A man who had been treated by his own army as a laboratory animal went home and became an elected representative of the same country that had done it. Not because he had forgiven it. His ongoing fight for compensation and acknowledgement makes clear that forgiveness was not the point, but because the other option was to let the same institutions that had used and discarded him continue operating without the accountability of someone who had been through what he'd been through sitting at the table. He kept fighting the VA. He kept showing the jar. He kept talking to journalists, to officials, to anyone who would listen. He kept asking for proper compensation, not just for himself, but for the men who had gone through the same program and could no longer speak for themselves. Rollins continued to address the federal government about recognizing the servicemen who were forced to submit to the chemical exposure. That sentence is from his obituary. Continued to address until the end. Rollins Edwards became the first black elected official in Dorchester County. He did this while simultaneously fighting the same government he had been elected to serve for compensation for what that government had done to him. What do you think it takes to hold both of those things simultaneously, to serve an institution and resist it at the same time for decades without letting either commitment destroy the other? The men who went through those rooms with Rollins Edwards are almost entirely gone now. The scientists who designed the program are gone. The officers who issued the orders are gone. The administration that told them to stay silent or face prison is gone. What is not gone is the record, the Library of Congress oral history, the NPR investigation, the Post and Courier profiles, the 60,000 names in the database that NPR built specifically so the men could be found and compensated, and the 3,290 of them who were never reached. Subscribe so the next one of these reaches you. Share this so one more person knows the name Rollins Edwards before there is no one left who remembers sitting in the same room he did. Rollins Edwards died in 2017. He was 92 years old. In June of that year, a professor named Michael Owens at the College of Charleston published a book about Edwards' life. It was called Burned: Conversations with a Black World War II Veteran. The title was not a metaphor. The Veterans Administration, as of NPR's most recent reporting, had provided disability benefits compensation to approximately 610 of the nearly 4,000 veterans identified in their own database as having been exposed to mustard gas in the wartime experiments. The others, the remaining 3,300, were never located or died before the system acknowledged them, or were the soldiers whose records were so thoroughly classified that even the declassification couldn't fully reconstruct who had been in which room on which day. The program was officially acknowledged by the Pentagon in 1991. The racial targeting was not publicly confirmed until NPR's 2015 investigation, 71 years after the experiments themselves.
Senators wrote to the Secretary of Defense after NPR's investigation, asking for the Black, Puerto Rican, and Japanese American veterans who had been specifically targeted by race to be formally acknowledged and compensated. What came of those letters is not fully reflected in the available public record. What is fully reflected in the available public record is a man named Rollins Edwards was drafted in 1943 to fight the country's enemies. His own army put him in a room for 30 days and pumped chemical weapons into it. It told him to keep quiet or go to prison. He carried the evidence of what had been done to him in a jar for years because nobody would believe him without it. He became an elected official. He kept fighting. He died at 95, still asking for accountability. The jar was not a metaphor. The burn was not a metaphor. The 40-year prison threat was not a metaphor. None of it was a metaphor. It was what the United States Army did to Rollins Edwards and to tens of thousands of men like him in 1944, in the name of a war against a regime whose racial ideology the world had correctly identified as the defining evil of the century. It felt like you were on fire. If this story told you something you didn't know before today, write down the one detail that landed hardest, not a summary, just the thing, and type Rollins Edwards' name in the comments, because he spent his entire life trying to make people hear this, so we say his name. No manufactured urgency here. If this gave you something worth knowing, subscribe so the next one reaches you and share it with one person. Rollins Edwards carried a jar of his own dead skin to prove what happened to him. The least we can do is make sure what happened to him is known. That is the whole ask.